So based on this, let's just elaborate on the definition of a self-concept. A self-concept is a fundamental summary evaluation of one's effectiveness based on one's premises and related standards of value. Does that make sense? I want to stop there just for a moment to make sure we're all on the same page. Any questions about that? It's important to understand because I'm going to ask you to apply it in about 2 minutes. Now, as the story I just gave and earlier material in this talk indicates, one's premises and their related standards can be mistaken, unrealistic, irrational. If this is the case, then one's self-evaluation will be mistaken. And the result will that you will suffer emotionally because of it, because you're holding yourself to a standard that's unreal, that you really can't achieve, or very few people can achieve. So it's very important to look at one's standards and one's premises to identify whether they're realistic. Okay, so we've got the formula, we've got the definition of a self-concept. Let's bring this full circle and revisit our client, Sharon, who we talked about at the beginning of this talk. And what I'll do is I'll reread the presenting issue, but I won't read every word. And I would like you to think of that formula as you're listening. Of premise, standard of evaluation, standard of value, and then self-evaluation. And see if you hear some of this stuff as you listen. Okay. So Sharon was a 37-year-old special education teacher. Her presenting concern was that she felt exploited and taken for granted by her husband, Jim. Her husband's attitude toward her was not one in which she was viewed and treated as an equal, but rather she was regarded as a menial who could take care of all the day-to-day tasks while he pursued a successful career. Now, her attempts to achieve equal status, respect, and appreciation had taken two basic and repetitive forms. The essential strategy had been to try to be a good wife. This entailed, in her view, assuming virtually all of the family responsibilities on top of her own full-time job, demanding little of her husband, and trying in many ways to maintain a smooth harmony in the home. And her husband really reacted in a way suggestive of someone who just accepted that as his due. The other tactic had been to confront her husband angrily about his attitude and behavior. There was a fierce counterattack and prolonged periods of bitterness between them, and their marriage didn't improve. So again, at the time of the clinical intake, Sharon feared that her position was a hopeless one. She didn't want to get divorced, but was thinking about it. And she viewed herself as thoroughly victimized by her husband and as helpless to change the relationship in such a way that she'd feel valued, respected, and equal with him. So you've heard this 2 times now. And you've got the formula and the definition of the self-concept. I'll open this up. What is the primary premise here? And if you want, think of my example where the premise was an outstanding student, etc. What's the primary premise for Sharon?
She had a mistaken premise of what it takes to be a good wife.
Okay, but what is that premise specifically?
The premise of the managing all the household tasks and asking little of her husband and having all of what she does.
And what did she call that? What was her essential strategy?
Just being a good wife that he needs.
There it is. So if you put that together, a good wife is someone who takes care of all the day-to-day responsibilities, demands little of her husband, etc. That's the premise. That's what a good wife does. So then what's the standard of value? Again, a standard of value is the behavioral criteria and even an image of someone in your mind. So what in this case? Yeah, Mike.
Managing all the household stuff and asking little husband.
Exactly right. It was almost contained in the premise, right? Because a premise defines the standard of value. What was the self-evaluation and by extension the self-concept?
Didn't you initially say she wanted to be treated as an equal?
Yes.
So isn't that the premise?
That's the desire. That's the end goal. The premise is an idea that's assumed true that sets a course of action to achieve that goal. So what was the self-evaluation and the self-concept?
She was horrible.
She was what?
Horrible.
She was horrible?
Or she didn't meet her standards.
Well, she didn't meet her standards, and how specifically, based on what you recall of my reading of that presentation, what did she say about herself and how she felt?
She couldn't live up to her standards. She couldn't.
Well, she didn't say that, actually, did she?
She felt like she couldn't live up to what she perceived her husband wanted her. It was her self-concept, but she projected it on to him.
Maybe. I mean, you're on the right track there, but if you could think of one or two words, self-description, so to speak, that go along the lines of what you're saying, what would that be?
Menial.
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 A menial. What's another one?
Exploited.
Exploited. What's another one?
Victim.
A victim. And what was her situation then? You remember what she said about her situation?
Helpless.
Hopeless, exactly. And helpless, exactly. Helpless and hopeless. Well, if you're a victim, a menial, someone whose job it is to do everything, you're going to feel pretty hopeless. Your situation is going to be hopeless. So let's address two of the questions that I posed after reading this the first time. First, is Sharon's self-concept actively involved in these events, or is it really just an afterthought, a general label she applies to herself on the basis of these events over which she has no control? That's the first question. Is her self-concept actively involved? Recall that we don't simply take in and automatically act on perceptual data. We have concepts that help us integrate and process vast amounts of information and enable us to go beyond the range of our immediate environment, whatever that may be. These concepts form premises, propositions, and principles that govern our behavior. For Sharon, the concept of a good wife was defined in a premise, as was said, as someone who takes on all these responsibilities, who demands little of her husband, who keeps the harmony in the household. That was her concept. This is what being a good wife meant to her. And that meaning brought with it a particular course of action and related behaviors.